Okay, this is Chick, and Chick, would you like to tell us your story?
All right, I'm going to start this off in 1956 approximately. And I was in Miami, Florida, and I worked around that area. I met a young man, we shared a house together, and he lived in Louisiana, so he decided to go see his mother. We drove to Louisiana in his car, and she lived in Slidell, which is a little town near New Orleans. And he decided to go off and work on the tugboats, and I stayed there for a while and got a job and worked in Slidell, outside Slidell, and lived with his mother, but it was way out in the country, and he really needed a car to get around. So I got a job in New Orleans, got to know people there. Then about 1957, I lived in New Orleans and worked there on Canal Street, down near the where the ferry goes across to the little town of Algiers. And I worked at a Walgreens drugstore. And this was 57 and 58 and 59, all through there. I worked around New Orleans in different places, and different kind of restaurants and drugstores and stuff like that. And for the sake of a name, I saw this man, I'm going to call him Mr. X. He used to hand out pamphlets, and at that time I didn't know who he was. And I used to see him handing out these little pamphlets, and they had to do with Marxism and things like that. And I'd see him with somebody that looked very much like him, and they could almost look like brothers. The other person was a little bit taller and a little bit heavier. So I didn't pay any attention to any of that then. But years later, while I was living there in New Orleans, I go to a cafe after work, and it's called the Casa de la Marina, and it was on Decatur Street, right near the French Market, and I worked at the French Market then. And I go there after work and have some beer and sit around and talk to people, and they had a combo that was in the middle of the room, and then the bar was built around it. And they'd give out all kinds of tambourines, maracas, bongos, whatever you wanted to play with. So I used to go in and play the bongos and have some fun. And I'd see this guy, Mr. X, all the time, a lot of times with the same person that looked like could be a cousin. And they'd put his arm around each other, and they'd, laugh and talk. But they were talking in some language I couldn't understand. And I assumed it might have been Spanish or some other Latin language, because there was a lot of Latin people there, and they catered to those kind of people. So not paying any attention to it, I had later went on and got a job in different places, and went to school for a year in Memphis, Tennessee, for a company called Dobbs Tunnel House. And they were famous for icebox pie and pancakes. And they got me a location, but I had to work at night, and then I couldn't get to work when I changed my shift. So I went to Dallas, Texas, and I worked for the same company because I was offered a good job there. So that was around 1960, 62. When I got to Dallas, I lived in a small hotel downtown until I found something better, and then I moved to the YMCA. It was about 62. And I worked at a place, worked at the tunnel house there for a while, but they were all way on the out edges of town. And you couldn't get around very good there unless you had a car. So I got a job at another place called Toppers. And they were a place that had a little sign that says Toppers with a top hat. And there was another chain of restaurants, a hamburger place. And there was one that was quite near the Dallas police station. And I would work at night a lot, so they would call me from the police station and ask me to bring over coffee and donuts or whatever. And I'd walk over to the police station and walk down into the driveway and go in the back and in the downstairs door and bring it up to the different offices. And I got to know an Inspector Lavelle from doing that. And I would bring stuff into his office. And then his boss, which was a shorter man with glasses, kind of chubby, I didn't know his name, but he was in charge of the, I don't know if it was homicide or burglary or what, but he was in charge of most of the inspectors. And I'd bring him coffee or whatever they ordered.
Was that guy's name Will Fritz?
I think it might have been Fritz. The Fritz sounds familiar to me. So then, trying to progress myself and get better jobs, or while I was working at the YMCA, they would shift me around to different, living at the YMCA, they would shift me around to different coppers, which were one of them was across the street from the YMCA. And when I was working in there a lot, I happened to see that same guy that I seen in New Orleans, and I call him Mr. X. And he had a friend that looked very much like him. You standing next to each other, you could hardly tell them apart, except the other one was a little heavier, a little taller, and something he had a little mustache. And they were talking, and I don't know what language it was, like I say, but I didn't pay too much attention because I was always busy with other people. But I'd say hello and how are you and give them what they ordered. And then I got another job. I met this young lady, and we were thinking about getting engaged. So we got engaged, and then she lived in Richardson, Texas. And I was still living at the YMCA, but I got a better job at a place called the Rosebud Cafe. And it was even easier work, but they paid better. And I was a sandwich man. So this was around 63, November, and they had the parade, and all the people were there for the president coming, and the streets were packed, and we were watching it on television. So they showed on TV, the president got shot, President John Kennedy. And I said, oh my God. And I cut my finger with the knife, making a sandwich. So everybody was upset, and they closed up early, and I went back to the YMCA, and I went in the TV room, and I was watching the news and all that, and here they showed a picture of this person they caught in Oak Cliff, which also shot a policeman, and they said his name was Lee Harvey Oswald. And I was sitting with some people I knew. I said, oh my God, I know him. I used to see him in Dallas, in New Orleans. And they used to come into the coffee shop across the street. So me blurting that out and saying that, I knew him. Somebody told the desk clerk, and the desk clerk called the police and said that there was somebody there who was a friend of Oswald's, and they ought to talk to him. So they came down and they talked to me and asked me to come to the police station, and I did. And at the police station, I told them I knew Mr. Lavelle, the inspector, because I used to bring him coffee a lot. And he also was taking care of a case which was stolen checks that I had. He was finding out where the checks went. So he knew me pretty well. And he came in and he vouched for me. And I told him, he already knew that I lived in New Orleans, and I told him about that. And I never said nothing about Oswald because I didn't know who Oswald was, only to look at him. So they let me go, and I went back to the Y. And then I moved out of the YMCA, and I found a nice little apartment. It was a rebuilt garage. It was like a little house all itself. So my girlfriend used to come over there on weekends. And I told her family about it. And they said, well, don't get too involved in it. And I said, well, I can only tell them what I know. I'm not really involved. I just know by seeing them. And so after that, I had left Dallas in 65, and I came to California because I have a brother living here. And work was better here, and I had to get into the union, so I got better jobs. And then in 65, I lived over across the bay until 67. And in 67, I moved to San Francisco proper and worked some of the big hotels and some of the better jobs. And my girlfriend decided to move to Florida, so we never got married. And from around 67 or 68, I don't know exactly the dates. My mind is not good anymore about dates, so I have to look at something, refresh my memory. That's why I'm holding this up, so that I can look at the dates and remember what happened. Then around 65, 67, I had previously got a photograph from a friend in Dallas, Texas, that worked at the Dallas Morning News, and he took a picture of John Kennedy and Jacqueline and Governor Connolly in a Cadillac going by, and John Kennedy was squinting, and Life magazine thought, well, maybe that was one picture they might not didn't have, and they looked through their files, and they told me to come back, and they said they might take a copy of it, but they decided not to, because they did have one that was so very much like it. And they were going to put this group of pictures in a magazine, come out with an issue of it. But they were interested in my information and knowing Oswald and the particulars about it. So they asked the FBI to interview me, and they did. And then the FBI asked me when I come back to Dallas with their expense, and I went back to Dallas in late part of 67, and I was interviewed at a Holiday Inn by the CIA and the FBI, and I guess some other local detectives. And it was a coincidence that I happened to know Oswald casually, and also this other person that looked so much like him. And then I have to go back because I forget. I also worked at a restaurant that was near the depository, about 2-3 blocks over further away from it. You had to walk past an old building that looked like a castle. They say one time it was a city hall or a police station. And the restaurant I worked there was an old-fashioned bar and grill. And a real heavy-set lady that worked there, she was also, she didn't work there, she came in to eat. She worked at the depository. But this was just before the assassination. And then I had gone over there after that, and they used to come in there for dinner, so I talked to the owners and everything, and they said they never had heard of Oswald. And that heavy-set lady said she never heard of him working at the depository. And this was in the late part of 63.
So this lady worked at the depository?
Yeah, she was a personnel director.
Mm-hmm.
She was a heavy-set woman. And she said she worked in personnel. So she said she don't remember Oswald ever working there. And I told her about seeing somebody look so much like him. And she said, well, she does know somebody that worked there that did look like him. And she said the name, but I didn't know who he was.
Billy Lovelady?
I don't really remember too much, the name. But I just wanted to put that in. I forgot to mention it earlier. So, going back again to 67, when I went back to Dallas, they flew me back there, a round-trip ticket. I stayed in a Holiday Inn, and I was interviewed by the CIA and the FBI, and I also told them that I knew of this place called Rock's Pawn Shop, because the engagement ring that I had, it was originally a stone from my father's stick pin, and I had it changed into a man's ring, and I pawned it in Rock's Pawn Shop, so I didn't have money to get here, and I drove a car here for a friend of mine, which was a used car dealer, and he had a niece that lived in San Francisco, so I drove a car here for her, and it was only a year old, and that was in 65. So I got the ring out of the pawn shop because the CIA people or Life magazine, whoever they were, they gave me some money to help me out when I was there. So I used some of it to get the ring out of the pawn shop. And I talked to Rock, the owner, and we talked about these things. And he said he can't remember Oswald either, but he said he knew of somebody that looked very much like him. And they said later, which I didn't know then, that that's where that rifle was supposed to be bought at. It was some kind of Italian-made rifle. And the things that I know now that I didn't know then, I talked about with a friend of mine named Jim, and he also lived in New Orleans, and back in the late 50s and early 60s. And he was in San Francisco here. So we talked about it, and he told me how he used to go to parties as a paid escort for a roommate or a good friend of Jack Ruby. And Jack Ruby was supposed to be bisexual and all kinds of strange things he did with animals and people and everything else. And he said that he saw Oswald at these parties, and that Jack Ruby was very much afraid of his sister and his sister's either husband or boyfriend, that she was very connected with the mob, and that Ruby was afraid that something would come out about Oswald being at some of these parties, and then him even having the parties. So he went up into the police station where anybody could walk in at the time, and he shot Oswald, and also shot the inspector Lavelle that I knew. And all these things we talked about was years later. And now when you put things together from information that I knew and information that I knew that other people knew, it seems like that the mob or somebody higher up had an awful lot to do with the assassination. And that it wasn't Oswald at all. That it was somebody else. And only time can tell these things. So that's why I'm giving this statement and information so it will help the truth to come out. Because John Kennedy was a good person. I don't think it ever should have happened. Then when I came to San Francisco, I also worked for the help to get elected Robert Kennedy. And they had a party for the people that worked on the campaign, and it was held at the Fairmont, and Rose Kennedy was there, and she hosted it, and we sat and talked about a lot of things, but I never told her what I knew about Oswald. But that woman really gone through a lot of hell and a lot of heartaches through the years with her family. And I think that the truth should come out, and that's why I'm telling this statement. And it's the best of my knowledge to be true. I might have made a few mistakes on the dates, but the information is the best I can remember it. And that's all I have to say now. So I hope the truth comes out.
Okay, thank you very much, Chick.